Hey, welcome back to the Leadership Studio. Nice to see everyone here. Another great session this evening, so we're about to get going. We have with us today Leslie Chandler Wang, who is with the Houston Endowment. And I've known Leslie for a long time. And how long have you been at the Houston Endowment now?
It's almost 8 years.
Wow, that's a long time.
That's a long time.
Yeah. And so the Houston Endowment is one of the largest foundations. And so I want to get into this evening into what the endowment does, but more importantly, how do people approach foundations and how do they work with foundations? But Leslie, the first question I want to ask is, you deal with fundraisers all the time, and people are coming through and they're asking for money. So if you had to write a book on fundraising, what would some of the chapters look like for you?
Sure. So I should say, first of all, that my experience with fundraising is from the foundation perspective, so that someone who gave money individually or a different kind of foundation might have different chapters. But I would say my first chapter would probably be something along the lines of get your ducks in a row. And especially for an organization that comes to us, we usually work with ones that are a little bit more established, have at least a few years of operations under their belt. And we do expect them to kind of know their strengths and their weaknesses and where they're going with those. So understanding where you are financially, understanding where you are programmatically, strategically, knowing who your competition is. If we say, oh, it's interesting you're doing that, isn't so-and-so doing that? Be prepared to tell us, yeah, I know all about them. I know how they operate. Here's how we complement them, or here's how we're better than they are. But to really know your market and to be prepared to make the case for why you're worth investing in. So the first would be to make sure you know your organization, all of it,
it's interesting,
very well.
Getting your ducks in a row, you would think that would be a natural, right? That people would have their ducks in a row. But I see it all the time as well. I mean, people who want something, but they don't know how to express it, or they don't have their ducks in a row.
And it's, I think sometimes I'm surprised at, I've actually met with someone in a development capacity that when I asked questions about their financial position, didn't know anything about their financial position and said, well, I'm not on, that's not part of my business. And I was like, well, but if you're asking for money, you need to know why you need it. And if you have a big surplus and I'm saying, well, why do you need additional support? You should have an argument ready for that, why that is the case. And I think sometimes things can get compartmentalized in an organization and there isn't enough talking, but anyone who's going to go out and ask for money on behalf of an organization really should know not only the ins and outs of their current state, but of where they're trying to go. And I'm often surprised by, we meet with a lot of people who have a great idea. And I enjoy that, that's fun. But
and sometimes it's a self-proclaimed great idea.
It's often a self-proclaimed great idea. But that you, in addition to having a great idea, you need to know if someone else has already had that great idea. And I'm all for competition in the marketplace. Just because someone else is already doing it doesn't mean they're doing it as well as it could be done or as thoroughly as it could be done. But you've got to be able to make your case why your great idea deserves a place on the stage and to have additional funding go toward it when there's such competition for resources.
Do you have a lot of small nonprofits come to you?
We have a range. We definitely have a range, and that's something that we try to look at, not necessarily the size of the organization itself, but the impact of the organization in its field and in the community. So we certainly don't have a threshold for, if you're not X dollars in revenues per year, that we can't have a conversation. But we do look at overall impact. And there are some groups that are so small that the time it takes to go through our process is too burdensome to really be worth it for the dollars that they might see in return on both sides.
But I guess if you're an ambitious small organization, a great idea, you're doing good things, you're unique, there's someone you're open to.
Sure. I mean, we are much more accessible than people think. We usually... do
you meet with everyone who asks to meet with you?
I can't speak for everybody, all the program officers, but I would say generally speaking, we try to at least offer a conversation. If we can find a time that'll work, 20, 30 minutes, if you're representing an actual organization with interests in Houston, and that generally fits our interest guidelines. We won't meet with someone who has a a great idea for Oklahoma. We want great ideas for Houston, but
Right.
we are pretty accessible. Phone calls, certainly, meetings when they make sense.
Yeah. Other chapters in that book? Other little sort of little things that you
So
have?
the next one would be do your research about the foundations, and quickly followed by read the instructions, which y'all have probably heard before. But it's amazing how many folks will try to approach us when they really don't know what we fund, and then even once they do know what we fund, to try to convince us that they fit in our mold even when they don't. And we're pretty good at figuring that out. And it's not a good use of their time, it's not a good use of our time to try to be asked to support something that just is not what our board has determined is a priority. And we do have a new website as of a few years ago that's pretty explicit about what our priorities are. And so for us and anybody else, do your research. And if you really don't fit in that foundation's vision, there's probably a foundation out there where you do, and that it makes more sense to spend time pursuing them than trying to convince us.
Linda May talked a little bit when she was here, sitting in this chair, talked about how sometimes she'll get applications where they say, thank you, Houston Endowment, for what, do you find that sometimes people are doing too much cutting and pasting?
Well, yes, is the short answer. Not as much as before, because we did move to an online process where you can't send us a cookie cutter application anymore. It has made it incredibly obvious when people are cutting and pasting. It used to be we didn't have required a template, so you could send us whatever you wanted. Now we have set questions, and you can tell when someone really didn't spend time on it when you're getting the exact same text in multiple responses, where they're basically like, well, this kind of answers this question, but it also kind of answers that question, so I'll copy and paste it into both. And that's not good. It's not like that application's going to get tossed, but it certainly does not reflect well on the time it took to and the thought that went into making.
Are there ever times, Leslie, where you see an application for money come in from an organization that you would love to fund, and then you know the endowment would like to fund, but they just haven't done a good job?
Let me answer that in a slightly different way.
Yeah, sure.
Which is that we see the application as the starting point for a conversation. Applications in whole cloth do not go onto our board of directors. We as program officers create a summary document, and in collaboration with our team, that goes onto our board of directors. So if an application is poorly crafted, that is not that's not necessarily negative points scored. Like that's not quite how we work. But it can influence the quality of conversation that we can have with a potential applicant. When an application is really well done, we try to design very thoughtful, careful questions. It means you start that conversation at a different place, a better place, than if you have to go back and try to get information that didn't come through in the application. So when applications are well done, it means that we, as a foundation with the potential partner, can have just a better conversation, and it is more likely to lead, I think, to, if it fits, a recommendation, but also a really good quality recommendation from us. So yes, there have been times when something came in that didn't look great on paper that did turn into a grant. It's a harder process for everyone, and it does affect the chances in a more abstract way that it will not be successful, because it's harder to get to the meat and the goals and the purpose of that application when it wasn't well done to begin with.
You and I were at South by Southwest today. We were speaking in Austin, and when we were finished, you were telling me how lots of people rushed over to you to meet you because people came to talk to me about political questions, and people rushed over to you to ask you for money, right?
That's right.
So how often does that lead to something? I mean, is that a good first step if someone finds you at a Chamber of Commerce event or at an art event and they see you? Is that should people be approaching you or any other foundation person? Is that how it usually starts?
It can, but for me, not usually. I try to carry my cards. Oftentimes I'll get a follow-up email from someone saying, I enjoyed meeting you, can we meet? Usually I'm happy to do that. But where things happen more spontaneously than just an application coming in the door is when there's been a chance to have a real conversation. So I can think of times when I got introduced to someone through one topic and found out they had expertise in another topic, and well, let's have coffee over that, and then find out that they have a really interesting idea, and it grows more organically over time. It's very, I can't think of a specific circumstance where I spoke on a panel and then I had an introduction and that turned into a grant. It just, it's not quite that convenient, I don't think.
Speaking of you being on the panel, you got to be an expert on early education today. How does that feel for you, being an expert in an area? Because it would seem to me that just personally from the foundation, I would maybe be driven crazy by working at a foundation because you're unable to sort of do direct service. But how do you take that energy and how do you work that energy for yourself?
First, I would say that I got to represent a foundation level of expertise today, not an actual expertise in early childhood education. And one thing that's interesting about Houston Endowment is we do fund broadly, and so I've had to develop a useful working knowledge in a number of areas. And I joked with someone after the panel today that early childhood is one area, for example, where the more I learn, I feel like the less I know because it's such a complicated area. And so to me, it's actually, I thought it would be harder as someone who's been in direct service before. And to be a step removed is both awful and awesome because the actual work on the ground is exhausting. I was actually giving praise to you after the panel that the political work is just, it seems from a step back that the very necessary policy changes are a constant step forward, step back, step forward, step back, and constant negotiation and constant research. And we get to find the people who are really good at that and have conversations with them about how good they are at it and say, here you go do that really well and get to feel like we played a part in that, but don't have to. It's a different kind of work than actually being in it and sometimes I think possibly exhausted by it every day. The flip side of it is I do often feel like I'm never fully immersed in an issue. I'll go from an early childhood conversation to a child abuse and neglect conversation to a youth development conversation. And I don't get to feel like I'm necessarily getting deep in any one issue because I've got to go get somewhere else on another issue. So, and I do think the rewards are high, though. I mean, I think that even though the credit goes to the ones in the arena, that it's nice to be able to say we cheered them on and contributed to their success in a way that made a major difference. So it's both. It goes both ways.
Leslie, from a fundraising perspective and a nonprofit organization perspective, when you meet nonprofit organizations and their CEOs and their directors of development, what are the things that you are most impressed with about high-functioning organizations? Obviously, they have their ducks in a row. They're ready to talk to you. But as they operate as an organization, what are the things that when you see, you're like, wow, I love that?
Sure. That actually is top of mind for me lately. True vision, I think, is huge. To say it's more that there's a need in the community, but this organization has a vision for either how to meet that need or to take advantage of an opportunity that they see. So true vision and a clear sense of what success looks like. And that piece is a little more challenging. Addressing a need, sometimes you feel like you're doing work that addresses that need, but it's really hard for groups to say how they know that they were successful in it. So vision, a clear idea of how to measure success, and then I would say the two additional pieces that I would put out there, maybe three, I'll go for 5 total.
Sure.
Transparency, and that's tied to the fourth, which is a real dedication to continuous improvement. So groups who will say, here's the first strategy we tried, it wasn't leading to our outcomes, we realized we needed to correct, we're trying this now, and just share with us without any worry, and I know this is hard, but without any concern that we'll be like, what? that's not the way that you said you were going to do this, but to just share the kind of continuous improvement, the cycle of, try, test, regroup, especially as they're growing and learning, and will share that with us and be committed to constantly evolving as they try to achieve their vision. And then the fifth that goes with all of that is a true commitment to collaboration. And I mean that comes up all the time. It was the previous buzzword before outcomes became the buzzword. But it's to really look at useful collaboration, to collaborate when it makes sense, where it makes sense, not just for the sake of collaboration, but to put aside ego, to put aside turf, and to say, we could do this on our own, or we could say, this group down the way does it so well, and we're going to figure out a way that we each use our strengths for the betterment of our city. So all of those together, I would say. And then we like them to have a strong financial position, and, all the infrastructure.
Yeah.
But those would be my top 5.
It's interesting on collaboration. When you talk to nonprofits, they're quick. They know who plays well with others.
Mm-hmm.
Is it as obvious to the foundations as well? I mean, we know who is saying they're collaborating, but they're not. I mean, can you see those as well?
I see a range. I see over time, of course, you get to know organizations better. And I think there's definitely some who say they're in the sandbox who are not.
Yeah.
And then you have others who are smaller who would collaborate, except they're so focused on their own stability and growth and just trying to make it through the day, the week, whatever, that it's hard for them to find the time to get out there and make those connections.
And it takes energy.
It does. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of time.
Yeah.
And so it's not for a lack of interest, it's for a lack of capacity.
Yeah.
So I would say we see the range.
And the previous, the fourth thing you mentioned about the idea of it's okay to make mistakes in a sense, but let you guys know along the way. It's really interesting, right? And I think it's almost counterintuitive to nonprofits to hear foundations say, well, it's okay that if you make mistakes, just let us know about it. And we're okay with that. It's sort of like you're real people, right? You don't have to be, we're going to give you money and you don't have to be perfect as long as you let us know.
I think, so there, to be frank, there's some risk in that. We've had a group that said this changed significantly. Well, I'll give 2 examples. A few years back, we had been approached about a grant to help implement some specific legislation, and went through it. Looked like it would be helpful to a number of different organizations. Let's go ahead and do that. And then, long story short, all the funding for the legislation got cut. It was no longer relevant. This doesn't make sense anymore. So the leader of that initiative, said, here's what's going on. We really don't need money for this anymore. We'd like to deploy these funds in this way. Well, in that case where they talked about how to use the funds, it still sounded like a really good plan. It was still sort of in keeping with the original intent of the grant. We still had to take it to our board and say, is it okay with you if they use the money this way? But frankly, because of the breadth of what we're trying to keep up with, we really wouldn't have known about the change in circumstance if that group hadn't approached us. And I was really pleased that they did, and it ended up working out really well. There's just as much of a risk that they could have come to tell us that. We could have said, okay, sorry, that didn't work out. That wasn't the purpose of the grant. We'll need you to write us a check and refund the money. So there's a risk. But I would say we really would encourage organizations to look at their long-term relationship with the foundation, because we rarely fund true one-off situations. We tend to work with organizations over long periods of time. So that short term of keeping the cash on hand versus the long term of what else might I want to approach the foundation with in the future, it's much more important to keep that long-term perspective, because it's really important that we are able to keep a good working relationship with the groups that we partner with.
Are there some organizations that you could name that you feel like you're very proud of what they've done and your support for them?
I could. That's a.
Is that something you would prefer not to do?
No, it's just funny because then it's almost like an Oscars thank you list, right? Like, who do you leave off the list?
Yeah.
Not that. I know this is going to number one on YouTube.
Of a group
so Well, I'll give an example of a group that I feel really models the kind of the 5 features really well. That's Child Builders,
Yep.
and it's an organization I've come to know very well. They have a strong vision for what they see as they work with, their ultimate goal is to prevent child abuse by both teaching current children how to be advocates for their own safety, which is one component of what they do, but also to help children grow into eventually becoming parents at a time when they're emotionally and financially prepared to do that. So they have this 2-pronged approach, like help kids keep themselves safe now, which we can't put all of the burden on the kids themselves, but we can give them some tools. And then also let's help grow kids into responsible parents later. They really are struggling to figure out, they have a theory of change, but talk about a long-term approach with a lot of variables. So they're really committed to evaluation. And we've helped fund some of that. But they really want to figure out if their programs work long-term. And they've come back times to say, okay, we found out that this piece of our curriculum maybe needs to be revised, and that's not getting the impact that we thought it did. Or, we think we need to be working with this population, and they've had zero qualms about saying, well, we're learning a lot from this evaluation, and we're going to change our practice because of it. Their theory of change holds, but the way they're implementing is changing. And then they do collaborate quite a bit, not with everybody, but with the right partners. So I think they just are one that jumped to mind because I know that they're working on a continuous improvement model. There would be lots of others. Our annual report will basically show you a list of organizations we're pretty proud of because we invested in them.
When you look at the landscape of nonprofits in Houston, again, focused on fundraising and taking away sort of the juggernauts, the Rice University and Texas Children's Hospital and the MFA, because you're dealing with a lot of these directors of development, what are some of the really top performers that you see out there?
That is an interesting question because there's a dearth of, I'm not sure quite, of a pipeline of directors of development right now. It seems we often get asked if we know of anybody. So I cannot say, I actually have struggled in the past to give a profile of what a great director of development would be. And I think it really differs for the type of organization. I work with a lot of the smaller to mid-sized organizations, and they are looking for someone who will stay with them. But they're not able to offer a salary that is necessarily competitive for someone on a really kind of aggressive development career path. And so I often, we try not to advise too much, but I've often noticed that people who understand the field they're working in and can really not necessarily have a history of major gifts or not necessarily have run a capital campaign, but who can speak very articulately to the issue at hand and to how the organization is addressing it in a way that can help a funder representative who maybe covers a huge portfolio to help them understand the impact they'll make. And that person might be more likely to have the kind of tenure at an organization of 4 to 5 years versus 1.5 to 2 years because they're there for the issue and not necessarily there for the development career experience. Do I have that evaluated and evidence-based? And no, absolutely not. But I know that the folks I enjoy talking to are the ones who seem to be committed to the vision and the mission, not necessarily the ones who know how to smoothly handle a foundation representative.
That's sort of interesting, isn't it? Because you would think that your director of development would be very smooth, but that's not always the case.
Not always. And I think also if we had expectations for directors of development to act a certain way, that would really challenge us to be successful in our work because I think oftentimes there are many organizations that don't have a director of development. Their executive director does all their fundraising and maybe they have help from a grant writer. And so sometimes my conversations are just with an ED. Sometimes they don't have an ED. Sometimes I'm talking to the board, so we just need to be prepared for whoever comes our way and as long as they can help us understand where they fit in the landscape, how they align with Houston Endowment's goals, and again, what their vision and potential impact will be, it doesn't matter if they've got CRFE after their, to me, it doesn't matter if they have that or not.
Before we get to some of the questions from the students, I want a little bit about you. Now, where did you grow up, Leslie?
I grew up in Ohio, Cleveland area.
Cleveland, Ohio.
Yes. And
where near Cleveland area? What town?
I feel like, do we have a Shaker Heights connection for some reason? I don't know. I grew up in Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights.
Shaker Heights, yeah.
And I went to an all-girls school that my mom taught at. So I
Wow.
have that, yeah.
What was the name of that school?
Laurel School. And from there I went to college in California.
So how could you go from an all-girls school to an all-girls college, Scripps College?
Okay, women's college.
Women's
Dr.
college,
Bob.
yeah.
Women's college. I did not intend to. That was not my plan. The problem is I loved it. I went out to Claremont, which is a consortium of 5 schools, to visit Pomona College, which was co-ed,
yes,
and that was
yes.
important. And their marketing materials suggested that they had a beach, which they do not.
No, they're inland.
There's no beach.
Yeah.
I didn't know if it was a fake beach. I didn't know. Anyway, I went out to see them, had another half day, might as well see one more school. I'll go see Scripps, but I'm not going to women's college.
And Scripps is beautiful.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah,
it is simply
one of the most beautiful colleges in America.
I would say the most beautiful college in America. So I just fell in love. I mean, truly did. And they had a very aggressive scholarship campaign going on at the time and everything. And so applied, got in, went, and I justified it by it's a women's college on a co-ed.
Well, that's true, right?
Yeah.
You can take classes with.
You can, and I did. So so that's where I went, and then joined Teach for America from Scripps, which brought me to Houston. And you'll know now about my geography skills, since I thought Pomona might have a beach. I didn't know where in Texas Houston was.
Oh, no.
So I had to look on a map to see which.
And as you came to Houston, you were amazed at how green it was. Most
I
people
was,
are.
actually.
Most people are,
I was. I wasn't expecting tumbleweeds or anything, but I was not expecting a pretty lush landscape.
Yeah.
And have never left, other than sort of up to Austin.
Where
for
did you
grad school.
teach your Teach for America?
I taught at Oates Elementary School, which is on the east side of town, just outside the 610 loop in the fur feeder pattern.
Wow,
Yeah,
wow.
5th grade.
And from there you went to Austin?
I went to graduate school at the UT Austin Macomb School of Business, focused in nonprofit management. Again, took advantage of cross registrations and everything at the School of Social Work and the Public Affairs School to get a degree that I cobbled
And I remember
together.
going to a career fair at the LBJ school, and you were the only business student going around to all the tables.
I probably was.
Yeah. Yeah.
That were you really? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
that's
was,
right. The
yeah,
Boy
yeah.
Scouts were there too. I remember
yeah,
that. And I was
yeah.
like, you hire women? So I was there, and then came to Houston Endowment from business school.
Right. And was that the Houston Endowment, was it sort of a happenstance that you're looking sort of a broad nonprofit look, and really a pretty ideal job comes along?
Oh, it was complete happenstance. So it was the first time that Houston Endowment had ever done, which we now do, but had ever done a kind of a formal hiring process. All foundations are different, and Houston Endowment's evolved a lot, but often they're very networky, you know? So it's someone will just, they need a position, and someone will find someone, and George, my colleague, has joked and like, oh, hello, you're our new program officer. So it was the first time they had ever like published a job description and kind of done an all-call. So I was intending to come back to Houston. I knew I wanted to come back to Houston and work in nonprofit. And I knew that I could probably serve in a number of different capacities, but I wasn't sure how. And philanthropy really hadn't been on my radar. But in my final semester at Macomb's, I had seen an ad in the newspaper from the United Way of Williamson County, which is just north of Travis County, for community engagement volunteers to help them with their grant-making process. And I was like, well, that sounds kind of interesting and kind of fun, and I can do these things. And so I volunteered, and it was actually my first taste of grant-making, and it was a fascinating process. And as I'm getting further into that and actually almost wrapping that volunteer engagement, here pops along this job description from Houston Endowment. And I sort of went, well, I don't think they would consider me, but I can do all those things. I just got a degree to teach me how to do all those things. So I threw my hat in the ring, and luckily they had a ring for hats, and they took a look at mine and said, come in for an interview, and the rest is history.
Yeah. I remember when you were interviewing there, and George was very excited about you. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that from George, actually, because a few other people were like, a business degree, and what are you doing in the nonprofit world? But it worked out pretty well.
Well, let me ask you some of the students have tweeted in questions, and quite a few of them have. And one of the things that has been pointed out to me, by the way, is that not all tweets get to me. And so I'm trying to get as many of these as possible. But first, Monica Science has a great question. One of her questions is, how do you know if a nonprofit is ready to apply for a larger foundation grant? So do you ever tell people you can really be asking for more money than this because this is a great idea?
So large is relative, of course.
I do remember, though, going into the Houston Endowment some time ago, and it was Emily Todd was there, and we were asking her for money for an after-school program, and I think we asked for $75,000, and she said, you really need to talk to George and ask for $1 million. Oh. and I think we ended up getting $750,000 that time, and it was just like a big.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So we do sometimes ask people to ask for more money. So I've done that recently, where I was worried that they had made the budget too tight and they wouldn't be able to do everything that they wanted to do with it. One time I spoke with a group where they were asking us to fund a position, and I said, is this a part-time position? And they said, no, that's full-time. And I said, ethically, we can't do this. This isn't a living wage.
You're not paying enough.
Yeah. So we talked about it, and I ended up talking to that executive director later. We funded the position to be full-time, fair wage with benefits, and they talked about the impact that had on the organization-wide, that it really helped to help them get both outcomes and salary expectations aligned well. But in terms of whether or not an organization is ready, we'll look at a few things. We'll look at what they've done in the past, how they've managed whatever resources they have. We have to look at how much the grant is relative to the size of the organization. There are some IRS regulations around how much support can come from any one private source. So we really can't be the sole or primary funder of an organization. They would lose their 501c3 status.
And what is the rule? You can't be over 40%, I think? Is that what it is?
It's actually at least 33% of your funds have to come from public sources. And then we actually just went through a refresher training. It's a mightily complicated tax code piece. But suffice to say, for both tax reasons and also for sustainability reasons, we try not to be too significant a portion of anyone's operating budget. If we are someone's main funder and they hire a staff of 5, and then for whatever reason the next time around the board says, nope, we can't do this, we're done, we're out, that organization's out, those 5 people are out of a job. It's not really, we don't feel like the right thing to do from an investment in the community standpoint. So we look at capacity to manage the money, we look at past performance, we look at how it will affect their overall revenue mix, and we look at what's trying to be achieved. You know, every once in a while a big grant is warranted if it's going to have a big impact, and but we rarely, I would always recommend looking through any foundation's giving history. Just recently we had a group ask for a whole lot of money, and they were like, well, how would you feel about this amount? I said, and I wrote back, that's an impressive amount of money.
But it's too much.
Well, and you can ask for it. We don't offend too easily. We really don't. But if you look at our past giving, you'll see that there's no one in that range.
And you just brought up a good point. This is something very common, right, for foundations to say, ask for what you need. You could ask for anything, but you almost have to look for little clues from foundation people, right? So you just saying, ask for whatever you want is a way of saying you've asked for too much, and we've given you clues as to, but sometimes people don't pick up on those clues, do they?
Well, we try to not rely on clues. Like, I mean, we try to be a little bit more bold than that, and to say, part of the reason that I say ask for what you need, and again, the response to this group was, if you want to ask for that much money, go ahead and make the case for that. But I'll expect to see a case for that much money and for how it would taper over time, because we're not going to sustain anybody at that level. There's no organization that gets that level of money for 15 years from us. So go ahead and make the case, but I wanted them to be prepared up front. Go ahead and look at some of our other largest grants, and that's a more likely range for you. If they do a phenomenal job of making that case,
then
maybe. So I don't want to say, don't ask for it, but I also want to say, just so you know, don't get your hopes up. And I have that conversation a lot.
And that's good, I think. Richard Kendall has sort of a similar question, but he wants to know from the endowment perspective, from the Houston Endowment perspective, how do you guys decide, how you're going to allocate funds? How do you prioritize? Because I know you have this whole strategy. We really want to make sure this happens in Houston. Talk a little bit about that.
So we do that in two ways. One is that our board actually does set target percentages for what we're going to spend in each area. And so we actually work off of a 3-year time frame. We do multi-year grants, so we actually budget out 3 years and try to spend or allocate some of our funds well in advance. And so we have these general guidelines. But if you go into our annual reports, you may not obviously see the pattern. And the reason for that is that any large capital grants will skew those percentages in any given year. But we have them internally that we work with. So we have those general guidelines. And then what we do is we work as a team, and we actually make recommendations to our board as a team. So we are our own first gamut. And we have to work together as a team of program officers to agree on what recommendation will go forward to the board. And a big part of that is making a first round of considerations around, well, if we spend this money, it means we won't have it left for other opportunities that are coming up. But at the end of the day, it's our board who has to actually make the hard choices about where the money is going to go.
Okay. Amy Cole Guzman wants to know, and you may have talked about this a little bit, but she wants to know, when you look at the whole of the Houston Endowment, what are a few of the more transformative programs in the history of the endowment? Are there some really transformative programs that have been funded?
So I'll speak to what I know mostly in the last several years, and I'll try not to be specific to human services since that's where I am. But I would say that a few things that come to mind are we've done 2 large grants to KIP and YES. Those were made several years ago. The idea behind those being not to just fund their operations, but actually to see what it could mean for Houston in terms of school, the public school ecosystem, to have 2 major players in the charter school system with a lot of vision. And I think I would not be informed enough to speak directly to the outcomes, but I can say generally that we feel those grants have been successful and that they've really elevated the conversation around public school education reform and the work of the larger districts in our region.
Is Discovery Green one of your?
Oh, good.
That seems that's a nice transformative project.
That is definitely a transformative project. So that was a big grant. That was one of our largest ever. I believe it was $10 million toward Discovery Green, which had high expectations when it was put forward, that it has even far exceeded in terms of becoming a true oasis. In downtown Houston, preserving green space.
I think it's exceeded everyone's expectations, even the founders.
And there were concerns, ironically, that it would be empty on the weekends, and that it has become such a.
Do you ever go down there?
Oh yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Such a gathering place for Houstonians has been huge. So and then there would be lots more, but those would be the ones that would jump to mind. We've done quite a bit with the food bank in terms of helping them increase their distribution capacity.
Brian teaches a class here.
Oh,
as well.
does he really? Okay, so I would say that's been good. And actually the Cooperative for After School Enrichment, I think, has been one that we would point to as being transformative in the sense that it's helped develop an intermediary that's really improving quality and outcomes for kids.
I think Brian had Laura Arnold in here last week.
Okay, so good to know.
Yeah. Sharhanda Cox wants to know, what type of job would you consider after the Houston Endowment? I mean, are you at the Houston Endowment for the rest of your life? But if you weren't, if you decided that you weren't,
don't know.
What would be your next job? What type of job would you like to do?
I'm 5 years from retirement, so let's see. That is really hard to say because Houston Endowment has introduced me to so many phenomenal organizations.
Yeah.
I definitely see myself as someone who would always have to stay in an area of service, whether that's education or nonprofit or public sector work. So it's really hard to say. Houston Endowment has definitely, coming in as a former teacher, I had a strong belief that early childhood education was important because I was seeing as a 5th grade teacher this incredible diversity of experience and preparation. And I would say the work I've been able to do at Houston Endowment has really committed me to the importance of those years. So something with children, youth, and families, probably.
Very good. Amy Rogers wants to know, this is a very specific question from tonight, that you've moved to going to online applications. She wants to know, what's been the biggest benefit to that?
The biggest benefit to that has been that we can literally do, for us, there are benefits we hope for the grantees that we've talked some about, but for us has been that we can work from anywhere. And there are 2 pieces to it. When we went online, we also went again to this more thoughtful application process. And so the quality of applications we're getting has improved a lot. Not that they were bad before, we just weren't giving anyone any guidance on what we wanted. So now that we have more specificity in the information we want, we're getting really great applications. And then it's a web-based system, so I can do my work from any place. I can, in the middle of a meeting, if I have a question, I can pull up a document. It's enabled us to be much more flexible in how and when we do our work, which I think has been huge. It's also really, for us, this was a big deal. We used to have to do a lot of transferring of information from paper to paper to get from a paper application to a paper summary. And a lot of the more routine information that goes to our board is now auto-populated from an application, and that's been a huge time saver. I mean, awesome.
Time saving so you can give out more money, right? So
and have more real conversations.
Yeah, exactly. Magda Varenga wants to know, if tomorrow you had to go out and establish your own nonprofit, and so very quickly, now without taking much time, what's the first thing that comes to mind is what you would do?
So I actually, in grad school, had to develop a nonprofit, and I'm still pretty interested in the idea I developed.
Okay.
And there's someone else sort of doing it, so I would have to get my ducks in a row and figure out if there's still a need for this. But it was called Kids Teaching Kids. And I've always thought that a lot of people talk about teaching as a calling, and it's a profession that takes a certain type of person. And I thought, at the time, what if we cultivated teachers the same way we cultivate athletes and musicians? And I started working with them in middle school and high school and giving them the opportunity to start learning how to teach and mentor students. And so that was my nonprofit idea, was to start a...
And who's doing that now? Do you know of anyone doing that?
I've talked to somebody where they're doing a mentoring program with a teaching component, and then I built in an earned income stream so that we wouldn't be completely dependent on foundation support.
Wow. So would that be, how would you do that?
It was going to be a college prep. So all of our kids, of course, would go to college to get their ed degrees so that they could become teachers and would get loan forgiveness if they taught for a certain amount of time. But it was going to be such great college prep for them that we would also offer it to the community for a market rate and help their kids get into their colleges, and then all of that money would feed back into the organization.
And there are teaching magnet schools, like but they don't go so far as to do the teaching part.
I don't think so.
Yeah,
and I haven't actually looked into this in
a
9
number of years. Yeah.
But that was my idea, and I still like it.
Measurable outcomes. Sandra Helscher wants to know about measurable outcomes. Do you look for measurable outcomes with every single grant that you give?
Short answer is yes, we do. This is one of the trickiest areas, as I'm sure all of you all are figuring out. But we as a funder, and I think that this is going on in like pretty much all of established philanthropy, are trying to figure out how to ask we are trying to figure out our impact. And really our impact is your impact. So we somehow need to get information from the nonprofits, the grantees, about the impact they're having in a meaningful, quantitative way that then we can aggregate to figure out how we're doing. How to determine what are the outcomes that matter, how to measure them in meaningful, effective ways, and then how to use them to, yes, our benefit, but more importantly, your benefit, is a conversation we are constantly having. Evaluation is one of the most daunting areas that I have
And a lot of
started
people have no idea how to do it. I mean,
having said that, I think that, there are different kinds of evaluation, and we often get approached to help with the, hire the university, get the principal investigator on it, do this study.
Yeah.
We often get approached for those. That's one extreme. But there's also there are sometimes groups that I have talked to where I'm surprised that they're not picking the lowest hanging fruit. Okay, so you want to, your theory of change is that your intervention will lead parents to volunteer more at the school. Are you checking to see if your parents are volunteering at school? No. Will the school, they maybe won't give you the names. Will they give you anything? We don't ask for that. So there's between that study with the PI and the published paper, there's a whole range that could be possible. So I would say get what you can. Where there are obvious indicators of what you believe is success, get that information, because it's really, it is to me, it's a red flag when there's easy data, and it's not always easy, but when there is easy data and for some reason the organization's choosing not to collect it and use it.
Yeah. Denise Small wants to know if working for such an inspiring philanthropic and servant organization, whether that inspires you to increase your own personal giving.
Well, they do that very actively. Houston Endowment has a phenomenal matching gifts program. And it's, so we are encouraged to not only contribute to organizations, but they will match it. I think this is public knowledge. They'll match it 2 to 1. So it absolutely inspires me.
So do you have some personal favorite charities that you like to give to?
I usually give in a few different ways. So I give to my alma mater, Scripps College. And we're allowed to give. It doesn't have to just be in the Houston region. But when locally, I usually give in honor of other, a lot of, again, I work with early childhood and youth development, so most of the groups I know are focused on those populations, so to honor someone who's had a child or something like that. And then I also try when I can as an individual to attend fundraising events for certain organizations. And the way matching gifts, well, both the tax benefit and the matching gift process works, the charitable portion of that event can be matched. So I have to pay for my own dinner and my own dessert and one day my own drinks. but Houston Endowment will match the portion that's purely charitable. So it's, we could always do more, but it definitely is a fantastic benefit of working there that they help us they maximize the impact of our personal charitable giving.
Houston is a very charitable town, though, in many ways. One is that we happen to have some of the largest philanthropies in the country, right here in town.
So I am not as good at tracking the money as some other people are, but yes, we have literally a wealth of foundations.
Many towns might have, Indianapolis has Eli Lilly, and many towns have 1 or 2, but Houston, you start with Endowment, and then the Brown Foundation, and then the Arnold Foundation, and now the new Episcopal Health.
Yes.
These are very large foundations.
I think we're on track to have 7 or 8 billion-plus dollar foundations within the next few years.
Yeah.
George is the right person to ask that.
He knows all that
George
stuff.
knows where the money is. But it really is phenomenal. And what's interesting is all of these foundations have different approaches.
Very different
approaches.
Yeah.
So the struggle with that, of course, is the idea of a common application or whatever. That maybe isn't as close as people might like it to be from an efficiency standpoint. But the great news about that is there's a match and a complement for almost every good idea out there. Other foundations are much more entrepreneurial, and I don't mean that as a negative on us. We just, we like to see a track record.
You guys are a very conservative foundation.
We're fairly conservative, but there are others in town who you've got a good idea and a board of 3 people, and and they may run with that in a way that we're not ready to do.
Well, Linda May was here, with the Simmons Foundation, and she is much more entrepreneurial, right? She's going to give to things, and she's very liberal in their giving. Very different than you guys, though. And then the Brown Foundation is all families. So.
Well, so every that's what is the joke. If you know how to work with one foundation, you know how to work with one foundation.
Yeah.
It's true. It's generally true. Although all of us will say, please research what we do and read our instructions. Yeah. I promise you, every foundation will say those 2 things.
So
if we say don't FedEx the grant, we mean don't FedEx the grant.
Right.
Yes.
One last student question. Nicole wants to know, as the senior program officer in human services, do you ever get a chance to be involved in some of the other grants?
Oh, yes.
And you guys do a lot of collaboration internally,
and actually,
don't you?
technically, I work in both human services and education because I work in early childhood education. That's just too much to put on the website. And we work with one another's grants constantly. There really are no silos. Arts and culture maybe a little bit, but so many arts and culture groups work with youth or work with seniors or work with homeless populations. So we really are a very collaborative environment. I work with, it's very typical to have, if not even just to pull another program officer in for a site visit and a meeting, certainly to check in with them about what they think about proposed outcomes or their knowledge of a group. So I get to see quite a bit, and it's a fascinating insight into what is going on in Houston. I mean, we fund, goodness, we have about 400 active grants that probably represent 300 to 350 organizations annually. So we touch all of those every year. So to get to know about all of that energy and activity and impact in Houston through my role is pretty fantastic.
Yeah, that's pretty great. A couple of last questions before we finish up for this evening. So one, and everyone loves to hear this, what's your favorite restaurant in town?
You need my husband to answer this question.
I'm assuming you're going along with your husband.
Well, no, I'm not. I love food, but he loves food. So what are some of my favorites?
He's not a grant officer of the Houston
No,
Endowment,
he's
though,
not.
so.
But I know nonprofits. He knows food. He would put Kata Robata at the top of his list. I'll make a plug for a not as well known place, which is TH Cafe, which a friend of ours owns. It's a Vietnamese cafe over kind of near the convention center.
I've never been to TH Cafe.
You need to go.
And I've been to most restaurants in town.
It's on either Pease or Hutchins.
Right across the way there.
Just right across, I love Mexican food. I love margaritas. So I have a soft spot for El Pueblito, which was one of the very first restaurants I ever came to. I love...
it's a Mexican seafood, El Pueblito.
Yeah, but really the margaritas and queso and then the seafood.
Yeah.
I have a soft spot for Baba Yaga. Which I found on a rainy night, one of my first year in Houston, and I love this one's relative. Oh, Dolce Vita is one of my favorites too. It's gotten so popular, so I struggle with that. They have a new sister restaurant across from Hugo's. Something like that.
Pascal.
That's it.
Yeah.
You're much better with pronunciation than I am. That place, love that place too.
Yeah.
So.
Do you have a favorite sort of secret, not restaurant, but just secret venue or place in Houston that you really like? Any little park or a little
park
place?
Well, there are a number of small parks. Old Braeswood Park is one of our favorites as a family. Great shade and good toys and hang out with friends and have coffee. So I would say that's a favorite spot. The Montrose Library has long been a favorite spot of mine.
What a great, that used to be a convent.
That makes sense,
yeah.
So there, and when Craftsman Bakery was right there, that would be a favorite jaunt.
But Itsy Boys is now in that little place.
I haven't been to it, yeah. Well, I mean, we used to live walking distance from it, now we don't, so. Houston, I'm more of an indoor. As much as I love not being in the cold anymore, we don't spend a lot of time outside. I like the sculpture garden at the MFA quite a bit.
Not enough people go there.
No.
And it's free. People need to understand that.
Hopefully when they do their huge expansion.
Did you guys help fund the huge expansion?
Yeah. We did. That will increase traffic through there. Yeah.
Very briefly, work-life balance for you. I've had many women sit in this chair that say, unfortunately, I don't have much work-life balance. I mean, how is it for you? I would imagine as the grant officer, you maybe get a little bit more.
I do, and that kind of goes back to your earlier question about being in the direct line of fire versus being a step removed. One of the benefits of being a step removed is we certainly have busy times, and there's a ton of ground to cover, and there's always more reading I can do, and there are always more people I can talk to. But if I'm careful and I manage my time well, for the most part, I can count on a pretty steady work expectation through the week. Also, I'm out and about a lot, meeting with folks, and they grant us some flexibility. And I don't have to go back to the office if I have a 4:30 meeting. I can just call it a day from there. And then I find I do a lot of work after my kids go to bed. 8 to 10 p.m. is very often on my laptop. Hey, our online system, I can now work on summaries at home with no problem. But overall, I would say compared to some of the more stressful hair on fire type of visionary organizational work, I do feel I have a pretty good work-life balance, and I'm grateful for that as well. And so grateful for the people on the ground doing the really hard, exhausting work, because I do get to, I think, have a little more breathing room than they do. So.
And you're pregnant with your third child right now?
Third and final.
When are you due?
I am due at the end of April.
Wow.
And we have 2 girls, 5 and 2, and this is a boy.
Wow.
Yep.
Do you know a name already?
No, this child might not get one. We're struggling. We are really struggling. And so, but that's been interesting too, because, I've been working on early childhood issues since I started essentially, and I'm literally, and 0 to 5 being these critical years, I'm going to have 3 children ages 0 to 5.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I am an interested party in how this all works out in Houston for my own kids. And, I have an insight when I go and look at a potential child care center or interview a child care provider that has come through this work.
Well, I know we could do a whole show on early childhood, but it's amazing how much of the rest of the developed world treats moms and early childhood so differently than we did.
So differently. And I think there are, there's a lot more that could be done, but there are also really interesting implications for longer maternity leaves. I don't know the corresponding research in developed countries on what it means for women that they maybe step out of their career for a year or 2 years instead of for 2 months. So, I mean, there's a lot that's tied to, this could go on.
I know, we could go on forever on this.
But it would be an interesting area to study, I'll put it that way.
I think so.
Yeah.
Our final question for the evening, when they make the Leslie Wang story, who's going to play you in Hollywood?
At this point, I want Jennifer Lawrence because I adore her.
Oh, yes.
But I don't know what happened to her. The only actress I've ever been told I had some similarity to was, and I don't see it, but was Heather Graham. I think when my hair was lighter.
Oh, yeah. Heather Graham.
And my face was a little
I think she's
thinner.
Still in those Hangover movies.
Is she really? Okay.
So she's really made
I haven't kept up with those, but
she's
you're
really
right.
made a big splash in Hollywood.
Yeah, there you go.
So,
but no, Jennifer Lawrence is pretty badass. I would pick her.
Yeah,
I think
she's fantastic. Leslie, thank you so much for
you.
being with us in
Fun.
this class
Yeah.
and lively discussion.
Right. Good luck to all of you.
I want to thank all of you for being with us today. Keep up the good work. We're looking at all those papers. We're trying to answer all the tweets. I think I got to everyone who tweeted today, but we want to keep doing that, and we look forward to your increased participation. We'll see you next time here in the Leadership Studio.